Today's video is going to go over an introduction to programming for communicators. We're going to cover a lot of the basics of programming. We're going to use JavaScript, but this exercise is designed to introduce you to topics that are common across many different types of programming languages. The basics. So just some things to get started. JavaScript is a really common and very popular scripting language right now because it works really well in a web browser. It works well with HTML and CSS, and it can add a lot of dynamic interaction to user interfaces across the web. And it's mostly a client-side language, which means it runs in the browser, but there are also some installations of it, Node.js, for example, that's more of a server-side implementation. So it can have some of the functionality like a Ruby, Python, or PHP environment has. It's not Java. If you hear people talking about Java, it's not the same thing as JavaScript. They're very different languages used for very different purposes. And there are lots of code libraries that use JavaScript like jQuery, and we'll cover those at some point during the semester. So what we're going to do is work at first in the Chrome console, which we get to the same way that we get to the Chrome inspector with the control click on the screen or right click. And you can also do the view developer tools. And then there will be a button when you do that called console. So you'll start out in elements when you do inspect element. And you come on the screen and say inspect element. But we want to switch to the console. And we will do some things in the console, and then we'll actually switch to using some HTML pages and look at it in the browser that way. So many of the things that you see in this exercise actually use this first method, object and method here, console.log. That's really the default in the console, so you don't really have to even use it, but this just says log whatever we're doing here to the console. And I'll also show you document write, which handles it slightly differently. It actually writes it to the document that we're in. So the first thing we want to do is our very first program, Hello World. It's always the first program that you learn. It just sort of shows that you can write a string to whatever console or whatever document that you're working in. So I can say console.log, and I'm putting Hello World in quotation marks because that indicates it is a string, it is some text. And when I hit enter, you will see hello world. Don't worry that it says undefined. JavaScript is a loosely typed language, and so it will assume that this is a string if it thinks it's a string, and it's not necessarily strictly defined as such. Now, we can also just write in hello world in quotation marks. That will work as well. And I mentioned that document write object and method, and we'll see how that performs a little differently here. We do that, and it actually changes what's in the document up here. So those are just some different things I wanted you to be aware of. We may or may not actually use the console log as we go to get the results that we want to get, but you may see that throughout this exercise. So some basic syntax in JavaScript. All lines need to end with a semicolon. Now, we didn't do that here in the console because it assumes that, but we want to use good coding syntax, and all lines have to end with a semicolon when we actually start coding in scripts. And we will put arguments or parameters in parentheses. You'll see those when we create functions and when we call functions. And there will be a period between the object or method, just like when we did console.log, object.method. And then strings have to be in quotation marks, which we've already seen. So we're going to go through a lot of these things. I encourage you to follow along as you're watching this video and try to really understand what's happening when we do each thing. And then in class, we'll go over this very quickly and get you to some more challenging exercises. So in programming, we're going to be talking about different data types. Strings and numbers are very, very common. Numbers can either be integers or they can be floats, which means they have decimal places. Booleans or things can be either true or false. Arrays are lists. Objects are more specific types of lists. And then there's a few other data types that are there. So we're going to focus mostly on strings and numbers and then get to some of the more complex things later. So as I said, hello world was just text. Strings are simply text. They are represented in the quotation marks. And there is a method that we can use that some methods are actually defined in JavaScript, and we can just use them. And so a very common method is to determine how long a string of letters are. So again, I'm going to forego using the console log since you don't need it, but I'm just going to type in hello world in a string and then the dot length property and see what it comes up with. And it gives me 11. And if I said hello world with the exclamation point, because we're very excited to be here, it will actually count that exclamation point as well. Very simple, but a very common thing to use when you just need to assess how long something is. Sometimes you have to pull two strings together, and that's called concatenation, or more than two strings. And we use the plus sign to do that. It's sort of like addition with text. So we want to run different variables or different instances of text together. And so if I say hello, let's do this in quotation marks, hello, plus, and then we want to have an empty string here to put a space, then plus, let's just say we put my name here, and we hit enter. It says hello Cindy. Now we can also use variables to contain things and use them over and over again. And then we can use concatenation to be able to string things together with the variable. So in this case, I want to store a variable in a name. So in my case, I will say name equals Cindy. And it's just one equal sign. So name equals Cindy is stored in that name now, and we can call that anytime we need to. Notice I didn't even have to say var in front of that. Some programming languages require you to identify that you are establishing a variable, but JavaScript is good at all. It knows that you're doing that. So it just depends on what syntax you're used to. Now in this case, I want to say hello to whoever is stored in that name. So I'm going to say hello. And I'm going to put a space after it just so it captures the space, because the variable won't have the space in it. Hello plus name. So hello is in the quotation marks with the space, and then I'm concatenating whatever is in the variable. It says hello Cindy. If I change that name to Becky, and then I just rerun that same script again, and I am clicking the up arrow on my keyboard that will go back through the several lines of code that I have typed and rerun them. I hit enter, now it says hello Becky. If I say name equal Justin Bieber, and I run that script again, hello plus name, it says hello Justin Bieber. And so that's how we can store things in variables. It's a very powerful usage of programming that you'll see as we go further. And so here's just an example that I have where I've created two different variables, and I've said hello plus first name with a space and last name. So in some cases you can just put the space with the string. In other cases you have to concatenate an empty string within quotation marks to be able to get that space right there. And you'll have this problem. Things will come up, they won't look the way you want them to, and you'll figure out how to add your spaces. So we can do math in JavaScript as well. We can say 3 plus 4, get 7, 3 times 4, 12, 3 minus 4, get negative numbers. We can say use the division, 3 divided by 4 will get 0.75. And then we can also do the modulo, so that gives you, with the percent sign, that gives you any kind of a remainder. So let's say if we did 12 modulo 5, that's going to give a remainder of 2, because 5 times 2 is 10, and it gives you a remainder of 2 with 12. So sometimes you need the remainder for different numeric calculations. Now we can get substrings, which means part of a string. So let me create two variables here. Let's say first name equal Cindy, and last name equal Royal. So those things are stored inside those variables, and I have both of them in there, and they will remain that until I assign something else to that variable name. Now what I want to do is find my pop star name. J-Lo goes by that. It's the first character of her first name and the first 2 characters of her last name. So we can do this substring where I will take the substring of my first name that starts at character 0, which means starts before the actual string starts, and gives me the first character, C, and then a last name that starts at the beginning of Royal and gives me the first 2 characters, so 0, 2. So I'm just going to copy this so I don't have to type all this in while you're watching. Paste it in here, and I should get my pop star name 0. If I suddenly wanted it to be more like my actress name, like Jennifer Lawrence, and she's J Law, and I would want the first 3 letters of my last name, C. Roy. So you can see how those types of things work. There's a sort of an alternate method here of taking the first and the last substrings and putting those together. And as you'll often see in programming, there are many solutions to the same problem. You just have to think through the problem solving and how it will work for you. So often when you're working on the web, you may see something that looks like an alert. And that's something you just add to your code just to kind of warn people. Just something that's built into JavaScript. So a little pop-up will say, danger, don't enter, you are about to do this. Something that requires you to confirm will be like an are you sure, which will give you a yes or no response to it. Are you sure? You would either say okay or not. And that could be something that the person would have to respond with an okay before they could go on in the program. But a really valuable usage of this is the prompt, because that lets you store whatever is in there in a variable. So I'm going to copy what I have here so I can just paste it in here where it's establishing a prompt for name, and then it's going to log hello plus the name. So it takes my name, and it should say hello Cindy here. And again, I don't really need to have that console log there. I can come in here and get rid of that, and it should still work. Hello Cindy. So that's a really easy way of being able to grab some input from your user and getting it into a variable. We will do this later where we have form elements like we did last week where you learned how to make forms, capture that and being able to change things on the web page. But for now, just kind of understand how this works. So there are things called Booleans, which are either true or false, and we often use if statements to assess things, to assess their values and whether they're true or false. So in this case, here's a script that has a name, and then it looks at the length of that name, and if it is equal to 4, then it's going to log name has 4 letters in it. Otherwise, it's going to say name does not have 4 letters in it. That's all we're testing here. And this is not something you would normally test, but there are many applications of this, and we'll have some exercises that kind of take you through it. Notice that there are 2 equal signs here. We're comparing, we're not assigning. And this is a very common problem. I've made it a zillion times where I've used 1 equal sign instead of 2. But this is saying compare the length of this name to the number 4. And are they the same? If they're the same, do this. If they're not the same, do that. So let's copy this. And again, I don't really necessarily need that var. And name has 4 letters in it. But if I change the name here, I can either run it again here. If I just change the name equal Cindy, and I run that script again, removing name equal Jack in here, name does not have 4 letters in it. So we can run a script over and over. The variables are very powerful because it lets us change what's running through that particular script. So that's what I did here. And then here's another one that we can use with math. I won't do this for you, but it's got x equal 2. If x is greater than 1, it's going to say yes. Otherwise, it's going to say no. So you can see how it evaluates variables. You can use greater than, less than, equal to, and not equal to is a exclamation point and an equal sign. Sometimes you want to test if something is not equal. And here's where I'm mentioning the difference between 1 or 2 equal signs. So keep in mind, 1 equal sign is for assignment. If we're saying name equals Cindy, that is an example of an assignment. If we want to say, 2 plus 2 equals 4 to evaluate to true, we have to use 2 equal signs. Or in this case, if we want to evaluate whether name is indeed equal to Cindy, not that we're assigning it to Cindy, but we're testing for it and comparing it, then we would need to use 2 equal signs. So just pay attention to that. Okay, so now that we've covered most of the elements of the basics of programming, Now we can start talking about functions, and functions let you store operations in a program and use it later and use it over and over again. So if you look at the syntax here, we're actually naming the function. We're going to name it anything we want, and we have open and closing parentheses here that can either hold an argument or not. Don't worry about that for now. We will run these instructions within the curly braces, and then anytime in the program that we want to call this function, we just call it. We just name it, and it will run these things. So I can run it as many times as I want to. So I'm going to grab the function itself, and this function prompts for your name and will log what is your name, or I'm sorry, it will log hello plus your name once it prompts you for that. But it has to wait for it to be called first. So let's try that in the console. I'll come down here and pop it in. So nothing really happened yet, but if I call hello, now is when it runs the program. And it's going to say hello, Cindy. And you can also use functions as variables. I know that gets a little bit confusing, but sometimes there is a return value at the end of a function, and we want to be able to store that value and maybe use that as a variable later in a program. So just keep that in mind. So there are properties and arguments that we can often use. Here is an example of what we just did, but instead of just calling hello and prompting for it, we might want to pass in when we use the function. And maybe that's coming from a form somewhere, but I'll just run the same function again with the argument here of A. And so it's going to say hello, whatever's in A. But when we call it, we're going to say hello. So that's the name of the function. And then this is going to stand in for whatever A is there. Let me use a different name. Hello, Jordan. And now it says hello, Jordan. So anytime we want to run this, and of course there can be much more complex things going on in these functions that allow us to pass anything we need to into them. Now we get to more exciting things that happen in programming. We started with if statements, so that's a bit of logic where it has to evaluate what's going on and gives you an either or scenario. But sometimes you want to cycle through an iteration. You want to go through something as long as something is in place. And so there are while loops and for loops, and we're going to look at both of those. Every loop has to have an initializer, so a place to start. We usually use I for initializer, and we started at 0. Then a condition for it to evaluate, so it's going to keep running as long as I is less than something, and sometimes that thing that it's less than is an actual variable itself that's being evaluated. And then it needs an iterator, something that's going to increment every time. And this I++ is really just shorthand for I equals I plus 1. Typically, every time you go through a loop, you just want it to increment by 1. So I++ is the same thing as I equals I plus 1. The new result is the I plus 1. So let's grab this whole thing here, and we're going to say I am writing this 5 times. Let's make sure that it does it. And actually, I think in the console, it doesn't necessarily do that. So let's run it. It doesn't write it all 5 times for you in the console, but so let's modify that code to do the document right. So you can see here, it just sort of added it to the end of what I had here, and it's writing it 5 times. We would want to do some formatting on this, maybe add some HTML to make a break here so that they would each be on a different line. But you can see how it went through. It evaluates that I is equal to 0. So when it first goes into it, yes, I is less than 5. It writes it, adds 1. Now I is 1, evaluates it's still less than 5. And it's going to keep going through it until we get to the end, until I is indeed no longer less than 5. And then it'll stop and kick you out. So you can see here where I did it with the document right. And we can modify this just to make it a little bit better. We'll put the BR so you can see that it actually will take HTML, and I'm going to put one on the front end as well, so I'll put it in a separate area. And let's run it. And so we have this, I am writing this 5 times, each in its own line. Pretty cool, right? Again, you'll have to stop to think about how these kinds of things can be used in the programs that you're working on. But there's a lot of times that you'll go through, you need something to go through a list of items and evaluate them for a certain reason. We'll have exercises later. Now to get a list, in programming it's often called an array. In some programming languages they actually do call it a list. So an array is just a list of items, and so I'm making an array. There's two different ways that you can make it, where you can say new array and put the items with a separation by a comma. They can be numbers or strings. If they're strings, they have to each item be in quotation marks. It seems to me the more favored representation of an array, though, is using these square brackets. So instead of saying new array in parentheses, I see square brackets representing arrays more often. So I'm setting up an array, which is a variable that contains this list. So instead of it just containing one word, it's containing a list of words. And then when we want to access that particular item in the list, we can either say console log or document write the name of the variable, and then we use the index number for it. So let's run this guy and see what we get here when we run it. So we look up here and it gave me spoon. And the reason why it gave me spoon and not all 97s, even though I was looking for index number 1, is that quite often in computers and programming, and always in arrays, the very first element in anything starts at place 0. It doesn't start with 1. So all 97s would be index 0. So let's run that again, and I'll change this to 0, and we will see all 97s coming up there in the document write. So we can access those kinds of things. So here in this particular script, this actually writes a loop, so it will go through and it'll write each element of this array. It's got the I, it's got the, oh, I'm sorry. I forgot to go back and talk about a for loop, which is just like a while loop. I want to kind of back up here for a second. The for loop has everything that the while loop has, but it does it in sort of a shorthand where it puts the initializer, the incrementer, and the iterator all in the same, or the condition and the iterator all in the same parentheses here, and tells it to do it. So it's a little bit shorter writing, and I often use for loops instead of while loops. I just want to make sure you're aware of that because those will probably show up. But here's another while loop. We've started our initializer at 0. We have a variable that is an array that has my 3 favorite groups in it. But we want to print out each one. So while I is less than the length of groups. Now the length of an array, when you use .length, is actually the number of items in the array. And so that's going to be, in this case, 3, 1, 2, 3. So while I is less than 3, we want it to go through this 3 times and write out the name of the group. And we also want it to do with a break on the end of it so that we get one on each line. So if I copy this and we'll run this in our, we'll see here it started with all 97, Spoon and Wilco. If I run the same thing again where I put a BR at the front as well, and the HTML here is also handled just like it's a string or text. Notice it's in parentheses. So we concatenate the actual variable to what's in the HTML that we're doing, the text. So you can see here we've got Wilco, all 97 Spoon, all 97 Spoon and Wilco after that list was finished. So it writes them out. So now we're going to talk about objects. They're a different kind of list. They basically have some characteristics associated with them. So if you wanted to not only just store the name of the band, but you wanted to have maybe a list of bands that had a lot of different characteristics about them, these key value pairs, to be able to access them, we would put those within curly brackets. So we're going to have a variable called bands, and within that we're going to have a band that is the name, Old 97's, city, they live in Dallas, or they're from Dallas, and their genre is all country. And we can use document write to write that out. And you access it by saying the name of the object and then the name of the value, the key in that, and it'll give you the value. And when we want to have multiple bands in it, we would create an array. So notice the square bracket that would have an object as an element of the array. Each object is an element of the array. And again, we would still access it the same way, except we would have to access it with the index for the element in the array. So in this case, when it's the element 0 of this array, it's the second one actually, because we have, the element index 1. This one would be 0, this one would be 1. So we'd have bands 1 name, Spoon, bands 1 city, Austin, bands 1 genre, indie rock. So let's grab this whole thing and see what happens when we try to do it. I'm going to refresh this page here so we start fresh. So I'm going to put the whole thing in the Chrome inspector and run it. And we can see now that it did write out what was at that index number 1, Spoon, Austin, indie rock. And if we want to go through the loop and list everything that's in that array, then we just write a for loop, again the same as a while loop, that's going to go through. It's going to start at 0. It's going to look for the length of that array of bands. In this case, there's 3 items in it. And then it's going to write the name, city, and genre down for each band at whatever letter it happens to be at. So that's really kind of a fun and easy way to do it. It's not a lot of code. It's just all this data leading up to these couple lines of code down here. Let me refresh this again. So again, we get a clean view. I'm going to paste that in here. And you can see that it writes on each line the name of the band, the city, and the genre that they are. And you can see that down here. And it actually, this code actually includes a line break to include in here. So this is not that hard. What this is often called is JSON. When you hear people talking about data being in a JSON format, it just stands for JavaScript Object Notation. And that's all this is. This is an object. And we're using object notation to store each element in this band array. So that mentions it right here. At this point, it's important to point out how you handle comments when you're in a scripting language. In JavaScript, a single line comment is with 2 slashes, and you probably noticed I was using those. So in here, it just gave you some instructions as to what was going on. And that's often used. So up here I said, here's the initializer, here's where the band array is. And so that just says for the code to ignore what's happening. If you have a multi-line comment, then you use a slash and an asterisk, and then you close it with an asterisk slash. And to be honest, sometimes I use commenting to comment out parts of my code as I'm testing it. But often people use it to leave instructions or to provide information for other coders who are using their script. Very important to do good commenting in your code so other people can understand it if other people are using it. Help other people out. So moving ahead, now we want to talk about using JavaScript in an HTML document because that's where it's ultimately going to reside. And we all know how to set up a regular HTML document with a head and a body and a doc type. And in this case, we will have a script area that will have the information that we're going to run in the document, and then we're going to have some HTML that gets modified by that. So we talked a little bit about this in class, where we, in this case, have a span with an ID. So we can use this really cool method in JavaScript called getElementById, and we can actually modify what's in the getElementById. So according to the script, this says, hello, Cindy. But if we, or to the HTML, this says, hello, Cindy. But when we run the script and we have just this name change script that really doesn't do anything other than it puts John into the inner HTML of the span with the idea first by running that function. So we create the function and we name the function. If I put that, let's put this in an HTML document. So I'm going to open up Text Wrangler. I'm going to open up a new document. So I'm going to hide these things here that I already have going. And I'll just say File New. And just paste this stuff in here. And I will save this as test 1. Because I'm going to do a bunch of tests. And I'll put this in my JavaScript folder that I've been working on. So pay attention to where you're saving things. So I have test 1. I'm going to open that in the browser. Test 1. And it says, hello, John. We thought it was going to say, hello, Cindy, because that's what the HTML says, but this function inserts John. Now this, again, you wouldn't use this, you wouldn't want to hard code what you're putting in here, but you can imagine using some sort of a variable that either came from a prompt or from a form somewhere, which we'll do in a second, and inputs the change that needs to go in here, because maybe it needs to change a user's name and a new user logs in. Next thing to show you with this is, let me get over to where we have our code actually stuff. Now we often have events, so things will only happen when the user does a certain thing, like clicks on it. And you can put an event on just about anything in HTML. And we have here an on-click event that actually works in JavaScript, that when you click it, it's going to change this inner HTML. This is a very simple application. So let's save this, and I'll open up a new document in Text Wrangler, and we'll name this one Test 2. And we'll run this one in the browser. And so when I click on it, the on-click changes it to the word good work. And we can see that in the code where it basically just changes it on that inner HTML. So that doesn't even require a script tag. That's pretty powerful. If we come back here, going a little bit further and looking at this in a function, we can do the exact same thing. And I'm going to just replace this in this document for test 2 because it does the exact same thing, but it does it in a function. Basically, we have a function called change text, and on click, it actually runs change text. So it does basically the same thing that we just did, except when we click on it, it says you're a pro. So start paying attention and understanding the elements of these simple functions and events, and it will start making sense as we do things that are much more complex. Now, before I leave you, I just want to show you a more advanced use of getElementById using a form, because we talked about forms in class. And if I create one more HTML file and put in the elements here, this basically has just a regular HTML page. Here's our form that we have on the page that I've given an ID and nothing in the action. Within the form, I have an input just for name and a submit button, and then the form is closing out. And then I have a paragraph below that that just says, please provide your name above with an ID of your name. So what happens in the script then is it's going to get the element from the form on the submit, and it's going to use that in a function. It's going to create a variable called new name. So it's going to look at that form, create a variable for the new name value that's in the form. And notice the difference between the capital letter new name and the lowercase. And I just did those so you wouldn't get confused. This is the variable, the value coming from the form going into this variable, and it's stored now. And then what this is going to do here is it's going to take the getElementById of your name, which is the element that is here in the ID, and it's going to change it to bold. And then it's going to change the inner HTML. So instead of it saying, please provide your name, it's going to say hi to whatever is in this new variable that we created by pulling it from the form. Welcome to the site. This one requires a return false so that it just doesn't refresh the page when you go through it. So if we run this one, let's call this one test 3. And we run this one in the browser, you'll see that you can put in a name in here, and it says, hi Cindy, welcome to the site, and it's also in bold. So there's a lot of different things that we can do with forms and with manipulating the DOM. That's what that getElementById does, is it allows you to take something from somewhere and change something else that's on the page. So even though the code says this, the script down here is telling it to do something different. So we can do things like ask somebody to create a username and a password. We can evaluate a password to make sure that it's more than a certain number of letters. We can do any sort of evaluation on the length or creating substrings, and we can do all sorts of things with math and calculations. So we will have some exercises in class. As I said, I encourage you to run through all these exercises, even if you're just copying and pasting from the tutorial. copy them and paste them into your browser, or copy them and paste them into the console, and give them a try and try to really understand what's happening. I'll see you in class.